When people feel genuinely welcome for who they are, that they are seen as beloved, lovable, they can be a part of that everyday kind of interaction and can be part of that church is really important.
Welcome to Intrinsically Motivated, where we're having conversations with experts in the field of addiction, recovery, and those who've been affected by it as we seek to mobilize the church to replace addiction and mental health challenges with flourishing. In episode 4, we're talking to Dr. China Scherz. She's an associate professor in the Department of Anthropology and the associate dean for graduate education at the University of Virginia. This is a conversation about how a study of alcohol use in Uganda led her to study societal changes in Central Appalachia with regard to the church and addiction. I'm Tanner Clements, and I'm the Media and Training Director for Uplift Appalachia. You know, I have learned to understand what anthropology is, just at a broad sense. You know, basically, I wrote down something here, like recording groups of people and how they change over time. Is it something? Is that kind of how you would? What
yeah, I think it's about it's the study of human beings across space and across time. So looking at how human cultures and societies change over history and how they vary across different places and different cultures that might be in the same place, just understanding all of the different ways of being human and maybe in some ways of solving some common human problems, of how to take care of one another, how to relate to one another, how to get through conflict, and how to live in this world.
And you're just kind of there observing, seeing kind of how that's affected, or how?
Yeah. So as a cultural anthropologist, I am primarily interested in contemporary human communities and trying to get to know them through a method that we call ethnography, which is, some people have said, a sort of deep hanging out, where you're spending long periods of relatively unstructured time being with people and doing what they're doing alongside of them to the extent that it's possible to do that. And then using ethnographic interviewing, which is a kind of long format, relatively unstructured kind of interview to try to understand what's happened, what they're thinking about their values and beliefs and practices, and really trying to understand their world from what can sometimes be called an emic perspective, from a kind of inside perspective of how do they make sense of this world and what they're doing. And then an attempt to write about that and to try to make sense of it, to try to show other people how this world is set up for that group of people.
I love that you described like that idea of deep hanging out.
Yeah.
It's kind of cool. I hadn't thought of it that way. But
it's really fun.
Was that what kind of drew you to it? Did you always like hanging out with people, or was it?
I am a very people-y person, so I do like hanging out with people. But in college, my first semester at UC Berkeley, as an undergrad, I took an anthropology class because it was a requirement for the development studies major. I thought I wanted to go into international development work, and I took this class. And I was like, you could learn about people by just talking to them and spending time with them.
That sounds way more fun.
So fun. And I got to write a project about Halloween trick-or-treating and write a paper about it. And I was like, this is amazing. This is such a good time.
This can be my job.
And then from there, I found medical anthropology, which really appealed to me. The idea of studying health and healing and well-being using these ethnographic methods to try to help to solve health challenges from a perspective that really takes those things to be socially and culturally and politically and economically embedded.
Right. So I know you spent a lot of time in Uganda studying. How long was it between finding that you wanted to do that in undergrad and actually commit? I'm going in. I'm going to do this. Was that a pretty quick transition? Did you find that right away, or what was the transition like to that?
As an undergrad, I did some sort of small field projects and knew at the end of my undergrad that I wanted to try to go to grad school in medical anthropology. Took a little bit of time out and went and worked for a nonprofit called Partners in Health, run by the wonderful and now unfortunately late Paul Farmer. He was somebody who really felt deeply committed to the idea that everyone has a right to the same kind of health care that he would provide at, the best hospital in Boston was the same kind of healthcare that was owed to the poorest community in Haiti. And at a time when people were saying that it was impossible to treat HIV in resource-poor settings, he basically took excess drugs from the hospital in a suitcase to Haiti and showed in a very scrappy way that, in fact, it was possible to treat HIV in Haiti, and that if the world wasn't going to step up and do it, it was because they didn't want to and not because it was impossible. And so at the time I joined the organization, they were just starting to do directly observed therapy for HIV treatment in Boston. And I got to work on that project with him and many other really amazing community health promoters and other people from the hospital for about 2 years. And then I went and started grad school from there.
So did your focus shift at all as you went into grad school, or was it you knew now I wanted to really kind of refine it into something specific?
It did. I mean, I started out with a project that was about child protective services workers, because one of the things that had really troubled me when I was doing the work in Boston was the fact that we were mandated reporters, which meant that we were often in very complex ethical situations of needing to both be a support to someone and also being aware of situations of abuse and neglect. And so I decided to try to study those social workers and what they were doing and to try to understand how they were making the decisions they were making. As I got deeper into that project, though, I felt like, wait a second, I've wanted to go to Africa. This is my shot to do that. And if I don't jump on it, I've got a US-based career and I will never go and do that work. And amazingly, I had some advisors who, against probably better judgment, said, sure, like go ahead and do that. And so I ended up doing a project on orphan support NGOs in Uganda, which took a lot of the training I had already done around children and child well-being and the history of child saving and transferred that into a Ugandan context where I did my dissertation work on Catholic charity and sustainable development and how people were making sense of relationships of interdependence and the gift in Uganda.
I guess what were some of the big things that you started observing? What were the big things that you saw happening there just while
well, it's interesting. The main takeaway of that project was really trying to understand what efforts towards sustainability and making sure that we weren't creating aid dependence in community. And so at that time, there was a real shift away from giving people things to trying to create sort of self-sustaining community organizations. But in communities where interdependence is the order of the day and really the core of everybody's ethics, which is sharing what you have with people who have less, the effort to withhold those gifts was really seen as deeply unethical. And so you'd have these organizations that were doing everything right in terms of their, finances and whatnot, but were actually spending most of their grant money managing things in an increasingly bureaucratic and audit-driven way, being accused by the communities that they were working in of corruption. And so in this weird way, audit became a form of corruption because that's where the money was going instead of directly to people.
Right.
And so there was a real sense that from the local communities that this was not the way that things should be done. And so I ended up taking on a second field site, which was a Ugandan Franciscan orphanage that had been running unsustainably since 1928. And was sort of an exemplar of this kind of institutional charity, which people were at that time trying to move away from. But the community surrounding that orphanage really felt like this was an important space of care. And so I was trying to understand what the sisters were doing, how people were experiencing that. But during the course of that project, one of the things that became clear was that whether or not a child was doing well seemed to have less to do with whether or not that child was an orphan than it did as to whether their parents were drinking, whether their parents were brewing and thus profiting from the sale of local beer. And so I got interested in what the heck is going on with alcohol in this community? And a lot of the NGOs too would say, oh, you can't give money to men, they'll just drink the money. And I was like, well, that's interesting. Maybe there's something here beyond just not giving money to men. Is anybody sort of thinking about alcohol as a problem? At that time, so I went to the Ugandan Internet Cafe in downtown Kampala and logged in and found these WHO statistics that at that point was listing Uganda as the number one alcohol-consuming country per capita in the world. And I was like, well, that's interesting, particularly given that none of the NGOs were talking about it. It just wasn't part of the set of African problems. And so that started me down the path of a second project on alcohol in Uganda. And as we started doing that work, the WHO revised the statistics. And they had misclassified a lightly fermented porridge as a highly alcoholic beverage. They redid the statistics. Uganda still has a really high alcohol consumption rate among drinkers. But anyway, The
It doesn't look the same.
The project kind of changed a little bit. But
so what you can say is you started this project and then all of a sudden all the problems went away.
No,
you solved it.
We
You
fixed it.
Good
No,
job.
we didn't fix it. But what we did notice was that even though the NGOs weren't talking about it so much, and there were just 2 AA groups in Kampala and a sort of newly establishing program at the National Psychiatric Hospital, there were lots of other ways that people were addressing problems with drinking. And so the project really became about looking at those other techniques. So 2 collaborators, George Mpanga and Sarah Namarembe, and I started a study looking at what was happening with herbal medicine, what was happening in the shrines of spirit mediums, what was happening in the Pentecostal churches, and also what was happening in the AA groups and sort of more Western-style rehabilitation programs, and really starting to think about whether these other approaches had merits to them that we were missing when we were just trying to say, like, well, you just need more American-style treatment programs, that
Right.
maybe there were things happening. And we started to meet people that had gotten out of really horrible problems with alcohol in church by going through experiences of deliverance, in shrines by going through rituals that tied them more closely to the spirits that were bothering them, in herbal medicine stores where people were using emetic therapies that, made them vomit and while they were drinking alcohol to sort of change their physical relationship with alcohol.
Right. So and was that, and that was all that kind of that deep hanging out that you were
That
talking
was that deep hanging out. And a lot of the deep hanging out, some of it was done by me, but a lot of it was done by my amazing colleagues who spent 4 years walking with people, going to church, going to rituals, going to the herb markets, and spending time with people in their homes and at work and with their families and really getting to know them well. And that book we finally have finished writing it, and it will come out in February 2024 with University of California Press.
Very cool. Very cool. Was there anything like a really like unique experience that you maybe you saw? Oh, not everything, because like you were saying, like we're kind of looking at, do these traditional kinds of programs work? And I'm sure that there was some effectiveness there, but like you said, you saw different things being effective. Was there any one thing that really maybe changed your perception of what would be effective?
I think 2 things. One is the role of social support for people who are coming out of experiences with addiction. So in Uganda, the bar is essentially the only public space that you can go to, especially for men. You can also go to church, but other than that, church, home, bar. And so for people who were coming out of experiences where the bar was no longer a super safe place for them, figuring out where they could go.
You had to give up your whole community.
You had to give up your whole community. And so where do you go? Or where do you even go to find a job? A lot of people go to bars in Uganda to make sort of informal connections.
yeah.
If they're a brickmaker, that's where you're going to go to find your next job.
That's your networking system.
That's your networking site. That's where you find everything. It's all happening through these networks of social connection. So back to the earlier project, the sense of interdependent ties is vital. You can't do anything in Uganda without being in a network. And so having recovery spaces where people were able to build really deep, rich, materially significant networks was crucial. And a little bit of that happened in the AA groups, but the AA groups were also tricky because you couldn't give people material support. You could sit and you could talk, but that was it. And so the church and the shrine both created spaces where people could spend long periods of time. And unlike most churches in the United States, in Uganda, people can live at church. The main church that we studied had this enormous pile of suitcases in the main hall. And they were the suitcases of everybody who was basically camping out on the property and would stay for weeks or months at a time as they were getting themselves together. But there were, you could go all night church service, really common. So if you're somebody who's struggling with insomnia as you're coming out of this experience, this is the place to be. And so that
long-term community,
long-term, deep community, people finding work, people finding marriages, and the church is opening up space to say, like, okay, you're coming out of this. Why don't you come and be the person who checks the bags at the front door? And giving people really a role and a space where they could be and be seen by others over and over and over again as they sort of rebuild networks of trust.
So I'm just thinking about like churches in America and that culture that you're talking about there, where they're like, just come on. Was there a period where they had to learn to be that inclusive, or were the churches that always that way
I
in
don't
Uganda.
know. I mean, I think that I don't have a good sense of the history of those roles in these particular churches. But the idea that people need somewhere to be and that they need people is just part of Ugandan society.
They just naturally felt that.
It's just part of their culture for thousands of years. And that's just how people are. In a way that I think American individualism looks a little bit different, a sort of me and mine. And there's a lot of very strict boundaries around that. In Uganda, that's a little bit more fluid and a little bit more flexible.
If the only two options for social interaction had been the bar or the church, it's not as surprising to see somebody transitioning from the bar to the church.
Bar to the church or to the shrine, which has some sort of similar qualities.
Whereas like here, it's like you've got so many different avenues that people can find some sort of community. Sometimes I think the church is a bit resistant. Oh, maybe they'll find themselves there, and then when they're a little bit cleaned up, then they can come
here.
Yeah.
Right. Whereas in Uganda, we knew one woman who we write a lot about in the book, and she actually went to church while she was still drinking for months and came to church drunk and was there in the back and whatever, and did that for a long time. And then eventually had an experience of deliverance at an all-night service, and things began to change in a more sort of dramatic way for her after that.
So it's just churches, religious organizations, just all being available and affording that time and the community to each other is really what was impacting people.
I think that was a big piece of it. And then we also write in the book a little bit about this idea of a kind of not you-ness of problem drinking in Uganda, which is conceptualized in both the church, in the Pentecostal churches and in the shrines, as being brought about through demonic possession. And in the church, the task is deliverance. And in the shrine, the task is a more complex set of negotiations that sort of bring you into right relationship with the right spirits and free you of the wrong ones. And it's tricky. But this idea that it was never you anyway did seem to give people a unique way of beginning again and of beginning in their relationships with other people again. Oh, that was never...
It's a new start.
It was never you.
Right.
Now you're back. The real you is here. Welcome. We're glad to be, yes, marry my daughter. That's fine. And so I think that not you quality was profoundly significant in people's lives there.
And it stops being about you, and now you're part of us in kind of a meaningful way, I think.
Everyone there has had whether it was drinking or something else, they've in some way all gone through some experience of profound personal change, which makes what kind of substance it was or what kind of behavior it was less important than the being together in a new life.
So how long did that study last?
4 years.
4 years. And then now you've been studying opioids in Southwest Virginia, Northeast Tennessee. How did that transition happen? When did you kind of start shifting?
So in 2018... was at the American Anthropological Association annual meeting and hopped by the National Science Foundation booth because they had been funding the work in Uganda, said hi to our program officer, said good to see you. Thank you for funding the work in Uganda. It's going really well. And he said, you got anything on opioids? And I was like, maybe. And at that time, we had a member of the department, Joshua Burway, who he and I had been kicking around some ideas around opioid use in the U.S. and had been kind of thinking about maybe starting something up. And it was like, well, that's interesting that you should happen to say that. And so we wrote a proposal for a new project to try to take some of the questions that we had had in the Ugandan study about hope, about change, about religion, and about different models of thinking about substance use and recovery to a United States context. And amazingly, we got the grant on the first try. It took me 4 tries to get the Uganda grant, so I was quite stunned that it had happened.
It was supposed to happen.
Apparently so. And so thus we began.
So obviously you said that there was some overlap in some of the ideas going from Uganda to here. What was unique maybe from that, or maybe what was something that you were really specifically trying to see in
I think I was really interested in looking at whether Pentecostal churches that were engaged in spiritual warfare discourse in Uganda, they're all borrowing that from American churches, what that looked like here, and whether as people were moving through church around addictions to opioids and other substances, whether those stories were playing out in a similar way in the U.S. And, I think we have come to know people who have had very similar experiences to what we saw in Uganda. And then there's also differences. The different denominations in the United States are many and varied and have different kinds of theology and practice around the causes of things like substance use disorders, different kinds of sociality. I think American sociality looks different than Ugandan sociality does, and the substances are really different. I mean, heroin is not alcohol,
right,
and methamphetamine isn't either. The other thing was that this project really picked up looking at Suboxone and medication-assisted treatment as another sort of major path that's being used. And so we've also been spending time in clinics that are using Suboxone. And then the project really underwent a very radical transformation in the summer of 2021 when Josh Burroway left to take another job, and we were really lucky to be joined by Abby Mack and her work really doing the deep hanging out over a very extended and intense period of time of really being in people's lives and in church communities and in the clinic has brought a depth of understanding to the complexity of hope and the complexity of love as people are trying to live together and walk together through this crisis.
So just speaking of complexity, because I know we were talking about that timeline, you're saying up through 2021 and all the COVID happened in the middle of this. Like, how did that change your whole approach to everything?
Absolutely.
Or did it just change the things that you were seeing happen?
Well, it changed the method in a lot of ways because you couldn't hang out in person anymore.
Well, because I know that was around the time that we met.
Because I started hanging out on your Zoom Bible study, which actually allowed me to participate in the project in a way that prior to that, I was sort of the person up at the University of Virginia sort of organizing things. But since everything moved online, I suddenly was a lot closer. And I think that was a real gift, actually, to be able to participate in those groups and also to start doing interviews with people. I mean, we had over Zoom.
You got to see a year of change and
I did.
And a bunch of different kind of stories. And
as you know better than anybody, CRC changed a lot. During that time.
We were never big. We were never big, but we were very small for a little while. And then ultimately, it was like, this isn't going to be a sustainable way for us to meet people's needs. And so...
Right. Well, so much of what you were doing was about the sitting, as Andy would say, sitting on the curb.
Right.
Or having lunch, sharing the meal. And when you're on Zoom...
It's not the same thing.
It's not the same. You were sometimes grilling chicken.
I was making chicken.
But
and then I was making people watch me eat it. And that just wasn't nice.
But you couldn't share it with them.
No, it wasn't the same thing.
I think there's something about the being with someone in person that is really important.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And that seems to be what you were seeing. And that was true for your whole study, too. Like, you were seeing a lot of people being impacted just by being with people.
That's right. That's right. But I do think that churches, whether here or also in Uganda, really, they were limited in certain ways, but really tried to figure out as best they could how to meet people.
Zoom was a huge thing. It was the one, everybody experienced it. And no matter if it was a church or not, it was like everybody learned how to do some sort of online communication, hanging out, that sort of thing. But
so then when Abby arrived in 2021, all of a sudden we were in person and with people in ways that neither of us had been in almost 2 years.
Right.
So and watching people kind of come back together and navigate the togetherness.
Well, I'm curious just because it's like you're trying to embed yourself with these people. You're really trying to do that deep hangout thing. Yeah. And I would imagine the first time you try to start being around people for a long period of time, that might feel weird for everybody.
But then you just get over it. You're like, hey, you just hugged me.
But I'm just curious how people felt post-COVID, if it felt easier to immediately get to be around people just because people were so starved for being around people. If that transition was easier or still a little bit.
I think that the people that we've been working with in this project, including yourself and your church and your family, have been some of the most welcoming people I've had a chance to get to know in the world.
Well, I'd like to think so.
I think that the kind of eagerness to literally embrace you was something that was surprising at first coming out of COVID. Like,
Are we allowed to do that
People
again?
in Charlottesville weren't hugging yet. They weren't going anywhere. And here, people
Barely
were
fist bumping at the time.
They were
right?
not fist bumping. They were still 6 feet apart with a mask on. And to go into a church where people are hugging and dancing and being together was a little bit alarming at first.
I mean,
And
Northeast
then-
Tennessee was a little bit more open.
And then immediately became like, oh, well, this is kind of nice to be
I
back
forgot
with
what- I
people
forgot what
again.
this is like, yeah.
I forgot what this is like.
Yeah, because I mean, I was working at ETSU at the time, and ETSU was still very, very, distancy. It took a while. I mean, when masks went away for a while, but masks came back. And
Yeah.
it was this
Everybody's
stark
been-
contrast in
And
what
I
community
think-
felt like, and I think that's
Yeah. And, I think in a way it helps to illuminate. It was a time that was all about the theme of boundaries. And that is also a lot of what this project has ended up being about, is how people navigate. How close do you get? Where is it arm's length? Where is it not? How do I move in and out of relationship with people? Are we on the phone? Are we just texting? Are we on Facebook? Are we meeting? Where are we meeting? Are we meeting in my car? Am I going in your house? Are you going in my house? How many times are we meeting? Are questions that people in all of the churches that we have had the joy and privilege of getting to know are navigating, and that we ourselves in this deep hanging out mode have been navigating as well. And I think that's the joy and the difficulty of anthropology, is that you learn by being in it and by learning how to do what people are doing around you, whether that's learning to build a house in Papua New Guinea out of wood, or whether it's here learning how to navigate your text message settings in the appropriate way to navigate a very complicated relationship.
Right.
It's the sort of being in it and doing it alongside that is the real gift of the method.
So what were some of the big things that you think you observed the most? Like, what were the things that were your kind of big takeaways from your time doing this study?
I think probably the biggest takeaway is that this is often a very long process for people working, trying, practicing, getting out of problematic relationships with various substances, and that it can take a long time and it can take many attempts, and that can be a very painful process for the people who are working to change their relationship to substances. And it can also be a long and painful process for the people that are in relationship with them and caring for them. And I think really coming to see that doing that requires learning how to give, how much to give, how to take care of yourself so that you don't get completely depleted by it, and how to both ride the high of the hope and also know that it might not work this time, but it might work next time, and how to sort of weather the fall out of that so that you can try again and that you can keep going. And I think that has been a really profound thing to watch communities of people figure out how to practice love in really difficult situations. And that is a complex practical task. It's a complex ethical task. People in communities are debating with one another, like, what is it exactly that I'm supposed to do right now? And that, people make mistakes. I've made mistakes. And yet somehow you can repair and you can try again and continue to walk with people. So it's been a really amazing thing to get to be walking alongside.
Right. So obviously we're really interested in kind of the faith community side of this. What were some of the ways that you saw the faith community being really effective? And I'm not just trying to get you to say, well, your church was doing a great job this way. I mean, anywhere that you've seen it, what were some of the things or were there things that were kind of common threads throughout within the faith community that you thought kind of seemed impactful?
When I think about what it means to be welcomed and what it means to be sort of seen as a person, to be seen as just another person who's part of this and not as someone who needs to be helped or is in need or is the person being helped. Sometimes it can be as simple as just being allowed in on the laugh. There was a moment that you might remember where we were on Zoom together a Zoom Bible study night, and everyone was talking about corn dogs, which our previous postdoc, Josh, had never had a corn dog. And people were going on and on and on about corn dogs and showing pictures of corn dogs and different kinds of corn dogs and laughing about it. And there was somebody in that room who felt like they could be on the outs, wasn't quite sure if they were in the group or not in the group. And we talked later, and I said, man, that must have been really hard that everyone was just going around about corn dogs when you were in the middle of a really hard situation. And they said, no, that was great. That was the best, that I could just be there talking about corn dogs.
That was so much easier than everything else that I was experiencing.
Not just easier, but that I could be part of the joke, and that I wasn't somebody who was in need or who was different, who was also just there talking about. I was part of the group. I was part of the group. I was talking about corn dogs. It was funny, and we could laugh about it. And I think that sometimes it's really simple things like that are important. And there's an anthropologist named Julie Livingston who's written some really profound and amazing work on cancer treatment in Botswana. And she writes about pain and laughter and how important it is to be able to share laughter with someone in the midst of pain, and the way that laughter can be a way that people can be seen as people when they are otherwise in danger of being a non-person in a group. And I think that when people feel genuinely welcomed for who they are and for themselves, that they are seen as beloved, seen as lovable, can be a part of that everyday kind of interaction and can be part of that church, is really important. I think people who are dealing with substance use issues can often feel like they might not be lovable, they might not belong, they might not be welcome in various spaces. And so in the moments where people feel truly welcomed, truly seen for who they are, that I think can be a profound moment for them. And then I think churches that can really continue for the long haul through the ups and downs, that's really hard to do, but when it can happen, amazing things can come about.
Being committed for the long term really seems to be the most effective.
Yeah, and that, like, might look different today than it does tomorrow, and that's okay, and you're still here, and we're still here. And I think the other thing is, in a time where people are really rightly focused on overdose, because it is if you die, that's
it's hard to save you if you're dead.
That's right. As Andy would say, like, don't die.
Don't die, and then we'll go from there.
Stay alive. I think that one of the things that churches offer is a sense that there's more to this than just staying alive. There's more to you than just your sort of bare life.
We're going to offer you a hope beyond the life, because if something happens and the life ends,
there's that too. I mean, but even beyond sort of the question of the afterlife, which is, I think, important to people in church, and maybe a piece of the don't die yet.
Right.
Like, die eventually, fine, that'll be great.
But we want you to
die at a certain time in a particular way.
After certain things have happened for you.
Right. But I do think that there's also a sense that, like, you're more than just a statistic that's staying alive. Like, there could be a beautiful, hopeful future for you. And I think that there is a kind of, as the philosopher John Lear would say, a kind of radical hope, a hope that you can't even imagine what that life could look like. But if you can hope, and you can have faith, and you can have belief, like, maybe you can take that leap into another kind of life that you can't even imagine for yourself right now. And I think there's something really powerful about that.
It's deep hanging out. So obviously you're connected to it. How do you think you have been maybe the most impacted, whether it's from Uganda to anything in between?
I think that my own church community is not a space where people spend a lot of time together. And I think watching and participating in churches where people are spending a lot of time together has really given me a sense like, oh, there could be something to that, to having more personal relationships with people who share a faith, and that might be something that's useful and beautiful and good. I think being in churches where you have that experience of being moved by the Holy Spirit, by the service itself, who knows? But all of a sudden you are feeling something in a profound way has opened something up that's been really great. And I also think that just, learning about the Bible, learning about the faith from people who are deeply enmeshed in that in a real nitty-gritty way has been, I've learned things from that. And I think but coming back to the sort of project itself, I've also really learned a lot about what it looks like to love when things are really difficult. So in my own life, it's been a long road of with my own family, with my dad in particular, learning how to be in a loving relationship, but also one that doesn't cost me everything, and figuring out how to do that and what that looks like and where to draw the boundaries so that it isn't just we don't talk anymore or I'm completely a wreck because of this connection. I think I've learned a lot from people that I've been in relationship with here in Johnson City that have given me some guidance on that, knowing that I would come down here and Dale would ask, "How's your dad?" Like as just a little nudge in a direction that was really personally very important for me.
Yeah, it seems like it's a direct connection to that, being in it for the long haul kind of thing.
Yeah,
but the boundaries and all that is still.
But yeah, exactly. That like it's necessary to have the boundaries to be in it for the long haul. And figuring out what those are is a really complicated question. And I've had a thought too that, that to love in the way that Christ wants us to love, we also have to trust that our love is not the thing that's going to make the difference. That like without having a sense that, as Andy would say, like, good thing God's in charge of the universe, like without having a sense that it's not my action that is going to change the situation, it's not on me to make the difference, is necessary to be able to do the kind of radical love that this work and our lives in general, our relationships with our family.
Because then you're not bound to a specific result either. Like
right.
You're not going to have your hope completely
That's
wrecked.
Right. You have to let go of the attachment to the result. And also a sense that if I just stayed one more hour, if I just did this one more thing, then
be excited about the process and the obedience or the whatever it may be.
You're just in it and trying to figure out what am I supposed to do now?
Yeah.
Okay, maybe I'm supposed to go take a nap right now. Maybe that's what I'm supposed to do, or maybe I am supposed to pick up the phone.
I mean that kind of is kind of how we got with. I mean, when CRC ended up, shutting down, it was like
I remember that.
We said, we can't sustain the people that have, we can't meet the needs of people in an effective way in the status that we're currently in. So we're going to we do better to help guide people to places where they're going to be taken care of, make way more, and that's a hard thing to realize sometimes, to be like, you got to let go of some things for a greater
good.
Impact. Yeah.
And you guys shut down almost overnight. I remember talking to Andy, and it was real fast that things had changed.
Well, it was like we should keep going. Oh no, it's time, and there's no reason to.
And to be able to do that with peace in your heart is.
It took a long time for some of us to get to the peace part.
Yeah,
it's
hard.
Once the peace got there, it was like, oh well, let's do it.
Right.
I mean, because then you say it was overnight. For me personally, that decision. That change really was an overnight thing. It was like one night. It was like, oh, okay. Well, I guess we're supposed to do that now.
I guess we're doing that now. So, yeah, I think that, and I had a lot of sense of that kind of trust in providence, both from my own mom, who would always say, get your hands off the wheel and let God drive the bus, and really had a sense that, things were going in a certain way. And also from the earlier Ugandan project about these nuns who really had a profound faith in divine providence, that somehow their unsustainable work would be sustained. There's a moment with them that I've written about elsewhere where they're showing me their budgets. I asked them to see their account books. I wanted to kind of figure out where the money was coming from. And they were very open, and we had a really good relationship at that point and still do today. They opened up these books, and there was a line for funds from other sources. And there was a really specific number. It was $13,561. And I was like, how did you come to that number as this specific amount from funds for other sources? And I said, well, that's the difference between what we know we have and what we know we'll need. And we're just trusting that God is going to provide that from other sources that we don't know what they are yet. And like they had this real intense set of practices around
That's
laughter.
a pretty crazy way to set up a budget.
It's amazing. Around
like
laughter, around being together, around cultivating that kind of trust. So I think that I see that here too. And I'm like, okay, that makes sense. But also needing to be able to keep that trust alive when things aren't going well.
Well, I think that
it's
I'm just
not
thinking
my
for people
fault.
that are going to be listening to this, or people that we're trying to, as Uplift, trying to connect with, is trying to say, sometimes you have to just set your budget, set your hope. Like we're dreaming big. We want addiction to just be done.
Right.
That's a big goal.
Big goal.
But there's no reason to say, we're not going to say that we can have some sort of impact in that if we can get the church all involved in that sort of thing, and we're going to trust that it's going to get there over time. And I think that it's kind of the same. It's the same idea, but it's a scary thing to set big lofty goals like that.
Exactly. But I think there's a sense of being able to set the lofty goal, know that it's not you who's going to do it, and then that gives you the freedom to be able to say like, yes, I'm going to work, and now it's 6:00 and I'm going to bed and I'm turning off my phone.
And the next part of it will get taken care of.
And the next part of it will get taken care of. And like that, I think it's a hard thing for a lot of people to do. And but I think there's something about that set of trust, boundaries, love that is really significant and
that seems to be kind of a similar thread that's kind of gone through a lot of the places that you've kind of been.
It's true. And it's also, really significantly impacting my own sense of work, in my normal university job, which is much more boring than this project, like being able to say, yes, there's still 5 emails that I haven't answered, but I got to shut this down. I got to turn off my computer on Sunday. I'll turn it back on Monday, and there will be problems, but I will deal with them then.
That's a hard thing, especially in a university environment. As somebody
Absolutely.
who has recently gotten out of a university environment, it's a real.
It's hard for people.
It's
I
a hard
think in
balance
lots
to kind
of
of strike.
environments because we want to be able to fix it. We want to be the solution. We want to be the hero, and I think this work has taught me a lot about how to modulate that a little bit better.
That's cool. So what are you working on? Obviously, this project's still kind of ongoing.
This project's on.
So what are y'all still just right in the middle of the same kind of thing? Has it shifted, or do you have anything new that you're kind of looking for going forward?
Abby finished the big chunk of field work this past December, and now we're back for a few weeks to catch up with people and sort of where are they now, what happened next, just to reconnect with the place and what we're thinking about. And now we really start the big, difficult work of writing and
making sense of everything that we've taken.
Or maybe you don't make sense of it, but you start to kind of see what are the threads and what are the stories, and to really start the process of writing the book and
so that the book
writing
can
some
come
articles.
out.
Yeah.
And you've got a book coming out, and you said you already have a book coming out.
Yes. So the book Higher Powers, Alcohol and After in Uganda's Capital City will come out with the University of California Press in February 2024. And we're really excited. George Mpanga, Sarah Namarembe, and myself as co-authors on that project are really excited to be able to release it as an open access book. So people will be able to buy print copies, but people will also be able to download free copies as PDFs anywhere in the world,
That's
forever
very cool.
and ever, which was really important to us because we wanted people to be able to have access to it.
You need to know this thing.
You need to know it. And we also really wanted to make sure that people in Uganda and other Anglophone African countries could have access to the work. So that's really exciting.
So is there anything else people need to know that you're working on, or anything else that you'd want to like, hey, you need to know about this?
There's a great paper that came out in the journal American Ethnologist not too long ago called Keeping It in the Family on the moral economy of Suboxone in
I read
far
it yesterday.
Southwest Virginia that Josh Burraway and I wrote before he left the project, that I think is a really interesting look at the way that Suboxone circulates both formally and informally, often as a form of care, but also often as something that moves on a sort of slippery terrain of secrets and lies through families, through pharmaceutical industries, but that also provides a really valuable form of care for people. And so it really looks at the complexity of the sort of social life of Suboxone treatment in the U.S. right now.
Next time on Intrinsically Motivated.
when it's relevant, I can say, well, hey, yeah, I have had this experience, so this is how I've experienced it. Is that similar to the way you experience it? And that gives me the opportunity to meet someone on a different level.
Intrinsically Motivated is an Uplift Appalachia podcast. Uplift Appalachia seeks to replace addiction and mental health challenges with flourishing, and we believe that an intrinsically motivated church is the answer. To learn more, visit upliftappalachia.org.